There's a specific kind of silence that settles in after a tragedy. It's not an absence of sound. It's a presence. It's a heavy blanket that smothers conversations before they can begin, that fills the empty spaces at the dinner table, that screams in the dead of night. For the past year, my sister Sarah and I have been living in that silence. It's been our unwelcome third passenger, our constant companion, and today we are driving it back to where it was born. My name is Alex. The woman sitting beside me, staring out the window with eyes that don't seem to see the passing world, is my older sister, Sarah. And a year ago to this very day, her husband, me brother-in-law, my friend Mark, walked into the Cascade Mountains and never walked out. He vanished. That's the official term. It's a clean, sterile word used by park rangers and sheriff's deputies. It's a word designed to file away the unexplainable, to close a case that has no ending. Mark's truck was found at the trailhead to Whisper Creek Falls. His backpack, his tent, and a single empty camping chair were found neatly arranged around a cold fire pit at campsite number 7. The search and rescue operation was immense. For 3 weeks, they combed every inch of that forest. They brought in dogs, helicopters with thermal cameras, and teams of experienced volunteers. They found nothing. Not a boot print, not a snapped twig, not a thread of his clothing caught on a branch. It was, as the lead search coordinator told us with a weary shrug, as if the earth had just opened up and swallowed him whole. For the world, for our family, Mark is gone. Missing, presumed a victim of the unforgiving wilderness he loved so much. That is the story we are supposed to accept. It's the rational explanation. A fall, an animal, sudden illness, getting lost. But that is not the story Sarah believes. She believes something took him. Not a bear or a cougar or a sudden storm. Something else. Something that came for him in the deep, watchful silence of the night. Something that doesn't leave tracks. And now, she is convinced with a certainty that both terrifies me and breaks my heart, that the only way to find answers, the only way to quiet the screaming silence, is to go back. To return to Campsite 7 on the 1-year anniversary of his disappearance. She believes that whatever took him might return, that it might leave a clue, that it might speak. I don't share my sister's belief. I'm a writer, a man who deals in facts and narratives, in cause and effect. I believe in logic. I believe in the cold, hard math of survival in the wild. But I also believe in my sister. And I can see that her grief has become a wilderness of its own, just as dense and perilous as the one we're driving towards. If I let her go alone, I'm afraid I'll lose her in there too. So I'm going with her. Our SUV is loaded with more than just camping supplies. It's loaded with cameras, high-sensitivity audio recorders, GPS trackers, and a hope so fragile I'm afraid to even acknowledge it. This is not a memorial trip. This is not a search party. In Sarah's mind, this is an investigation, a confrontation. We are returning to the place where a life ended and a mystery began. We're going back to listen for an echo. This is the story of that return. This is the protocol for confronting the unknown. To understand why we're doing this, you have to understand Mark. If you were to build the perfect outdoorsman from scratch, you would end up with someone like Mark. He was an Eagle Scout who could start a fire with wet wood and a grimace of determination. He'd spent 2 years as a search and rescue volunteer himself, pulling less experienced hikers out of the very situations he supposedly fell victim to. He taught me everything I know about the outdoors. How to read the subtle language of a trail, how to respect the power of a river, how to tell the difference between a curious animal and a dangerous one. The idea that Mark could simply get lost was, to me, like saying a master sailor could drown in a bathtub. It was technically possible, I suppose, but it felt fundamentally wrong. The narrative didn't fit the character. In the first few months, Sarah's grief was normal, if such a thing exists. It was a storm of tears, anger, and sleepless nights. We went through the motions. The police interviews, the press conferences, the slow, painful packing away of his things. I was there for all of it, trying to be the steady anchor she needed. But then, the storm of her grief began to change. The rain of tears stopped, and a fog of obsession rolled in. It started with the phone calls, always late at night, when the darkness seemed to amplify her fears. She would call me, her voice a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. She'd re-examine every detail of the week leading up to his trip. "He was distracted, Alex," she'd say, her voice trembling over the line. "He kept staring out the kitchen window. I asked him what he was looking at, and he just shook his head and said he heard a humming sound. A low hum, like a refrigerator, but he said it felt like it was coming from inside his own head." At the time, she had brushed it off as work stress. Mark was an architect, often under tight deadlines. But now, in the rearview mirror of tragedy, these details took on a sinister new meaning. They became omens. She told me about his sudden obsession with star charts. He'd downloaded an app on his phone and would spend hours in the backyard at night, just looking up. She thought it was a new hobby. Now she saw it as him tracking something. This re-examination of the past was just the beginning. The real shift happened when she found the forums. Dark corners of the internet, message boards dedicated to a very specific, terrifying topic: unexplained disappearances in national parks. I made the mistake of looking at them myself one night. It was a digital rabbit hole into a world of high strangeness. The stories were all eerily similar, a litany of the impossible. Experienced hunters vanishing from their tree stands, children disappearing from family picnics, only to be found miles away in impossible terrain, with no memory of how they got there. And the recurring details, they were chilling. Many of the accounts mentioned a pervasive, unnatural silence just before the disappearance. All the birds, all the insects, all the ambient noise of the forest just stopping. They talked about strange, hovering lights. They talked about sudden, thick fog that rolled in without warning. They talked about a feeling of being watched. And they had a name for it. They didn't call it getting lost. They called it being taken. It was a form of modern folklore, a new mythology for a world that still has vast, dark places on its map. Sarah devoured these stories. They became her gospel. They offered her a narrative that, in its own terrifying way, made more sense than the alternative. It was easier for her to believe that Mark was taken by some powerful, mysterious force than to believe he was defeated by a simple mistake, by a random, meaningless accident. In these stories, his disappearance wasn't an accident. It was an event. It had a perpetrator. I tried to reason with her. I'm a writer. I know how powerful stories can be. I told her she was finding patterns where none existed, that grief was a powerful lens that could warp reality. I sent her articles on confirmation bias. I gently suggested grief counseling therapy. She looked at me with such pity. "You don't get it, Alex," she said, her voice flat. "You're trying to find a logical explanation for something that operates outside of logic. It's like trying to fix a computer with a hammer. You're using the wrong tools." The breaking point came last month. She came over to my apartment, a thin, worn file folder in her hands. Inside were maps of the Whisper Creek area. She had cross-referenced Mark's disappearance with a dozen other unsolved missing persons cases from that same national forest over the last 50 years. She had drawn a circle on the map, a radius of about 20 square miles. All the disappearances had occurred within that circle. And at the very center of that circle, like a bullseye, was Campsite 7. "Sarah, it's a cluster, Alex. They call it a window area. A place where the veil between worlds, or whatever, is thin. things get in, and things get taken. Mark didn't just stumble into the woods. He stumbled into a window. It was then that she told me her plan, to go back on the 1-year anniversary. They say anniversaries are important, she'd explained, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. The energy of the event lingers. It echoes. If there's ever a time to get a sign, to get an answer, it's then. I have to go, Alex. I have to. Looking at her, at the fragile, determined shell of the sister I grew up with, I knew I had a choice. I could refuse. I could call our parents, try to stage an intervention, and risk shattering our relationship completely. Or I could go with her. I could be her anchor to reality, her tether. I could stand beside her in that place, and, when nothing happened, I could finally, gently, guide her back towards the shore of the real world. I chose to go. I told myself it was for her. But if I'm being completely honest with myself, a small, traitorous part of meth part that remembers the absolute impossibility of Mark, of all people, just vanishing needed to see for itself. I needed to stand in that silence and hear nothing, just to be sure. So I packed the cameras, the audio gear, my own logical tools to document the absence of evidence. I prepared to capture the profound, mundane nothing that I was sure we would find. And so here we are, 6 hours into an 8-hour drive. The silence in the car has shifted as we've gotten closer. It's no longer just the silence of grief. It's heavier now, weighted with anticipation, with dread. I try to break it. I try to pull her back from the edge. Alex, hey, you remember that time we came camping up near here with Mom and Dad? And you were convinced a Sasquatch was outside the tent all night. Sarah, it was just Dad snoring. He always sounded like a bear with a sinus infection. The smile vanishes. Her gaze hardens. Sarah, Mark loved it here. He said the air felt different, older. He said it felt like the trees were watching. He meant it as a comforting thing, like they were guardians. She pauses. I don't think they're guardians, Alex. I think they're just witnesses. And just like that, we're back. Every road leads back to Mark. Every conversation is a eulogy. We finally turn off the paved road and onto the gravel path that leads into the Whisper Creek National Forest. The tires crunch on the loose stones. A wooden sign, its green and yellow paint faded and peeling, announces our arrival. The canopy of trees closes in above us, and the afternoon light is almost entirely swallowed. The temperature in the car seems to drop several degrees. Feels like we've crossed a border, not from one county to another, but from one kind of reality to a different one. Sarah sits up straighter. She's no longer staring blankly. She's scanning the woods, her eyes darting from tree to tree. She's looking for something. The ranger station is a small, rustic log cabin with a plume of gray smoke curling from a stone chimney. It looks quaint, charming, a little bubble of civilization on the edge of the wild. As we pull up, a woman in a park ranger uniform steps out onto the porch. She looks to be in her late 50s, with a face that is kind but etched with the lines of someone who has spent a lifetime under the sun and sky. Her name tag reads Jenkins. She gives us a friendly, professional smile as I get out. Ranger Jenkins. Afternoon, folks. Just checking in. Alex? Yes, ma'am. Alex and Sarah Miller. We have a reservation for Campsite 7. Just for 2 nights. The moment I say Campsite 7, her smile doesn't vanish, but it tightens. It's a minute change, a flicker of something in her eyes that 99% of people wouldn't notice. But I've spent the last year studying my sister's face, learning the subtle tectonics of suppressed emotion. And what I see in Ranger Jenkins' eyes is recognition. And something else. Pity. Ranger Jenkins. Ah, right. Campsite 7. She clears her throat, her gaze drifting past me to Sarah. who is still sitting in the car. It's a very quiet spot. You'll have that whole section of the creek to yourselves. It's not a popular site. Not a lot of folks head out that far. She says it like she's trying to warn us, like she's giving us an out, an opportunity to change our minds. I just nod, pretending not to notice. Alex, that's what we were hoping for. Some peace and quiet. The lie tastes like acid in my mouth. Jenkins looks from me to Sarah and back again. She knows. Maybe she doesn't know the specifics of Sarah's strange beliefs, but she knows who we are. She remembers the search. She remembers the last people who stayed at Campsite 7. She hands me the permit and a folded map, her fingers brushing mine. Her skin is cold. Ranger Jenkins. All right then. The road can get a little rough up ahead, so take it slow. Weather's supposed to turn tonight, so make sure you secure your gear. And be safe. She pauses, her eyes meeting mine. There is a genuine, profound warning in her gaze now. Ranger Jenkins. And son, she adds, her voice dropping a little lower. Stick to the marked trails. It's awful easy to get turned around in these woods. More than you'd think. The standard advice. But the way she says it, the weight she puts on the words, makes it feel like a coded message. Don't go looking for things that are meant to stay lost. I thank her, get back in the car, and pull away. I glance in the rearview mirror. Ranger Jenkins hasn't gone back inside. She's still standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching our car kick up a plume of dust as we drive deeper into the forest. Watching us as we head toward the place she knows is better left alone. Her expression isn't angry or annoyed. It's just incredibly, profoundly sad. As if she knows we won't be the same people when we come back down this road. If we come back at all. The final mile of the road to Campsite 7 felt less like a drive and more like a descent. The air itself seemed to thicken, growing heavy and still, carrying the scent of deep, damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely ozonic, like the air after a lightning strike, even though the sky was clear. The friendly, open forest of the lower elevations had been replaced by a primeval tangle of shadow and silence. The trees stood too close together, their moss-covered trunks like the legs of colossal, sleeping beasts. I glanced over at Sarah. She was no longer looking out the window. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. She was preparing for battle. I, on the other hand, just felt sick. The kind of low-grade nausea that comes from deep-seated dread. Every rational cell in my body was screaming at me to turn the car around, to abandon this morbid pilgrimage. But I had made a promise. And then we saw it. A small, weathered wooden post with the number 7 carved into it, almost reclaimed by the creeping moss. It marked the entrance to a small, circular clearing. Our destination. I pulled the vehicle in and put it in park. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, the only sound in a world that seemed to have been put on mute. This was it. The place where the silence had begun. The campsite was exactly as I had seen it in the dozens of crime scene photographs. And yet, seeing it in person was a profoundly different experience. The photos were sterile, objective documents. This place had a soul. Cold, vacant one. It was a perfect clearing, almost unnaturally so, nestled in a gentle curve of Whisper Creek. The creek itself was about 50 yards away, its sound a constant, low murmur, a white noise that seemed to absorb all other sounds. In the center of the clearing sat the stone fire pit, a circle of blackened rocks that looked like a scar on the land. A few feet from the fire pit stood a single, massive Douglas fir, its lowest branches thick enough to hold the weight of a man, its bark dark and deeply furrowed, like the skin of an old man. A year ago, This small patch of earth was the epicenter of a frantic, desperate search. It was a stage of controlled chaos, men in bright orange vests, German shepherds straining at their leashes, the crackle of radios, the glint of equipment under harsh floodlights. It was a place defined by its urgent purpose, to find. Now it was defined by an absence. The peace was not calming. It was predatory. It was the quiet of a room after a scream. It was the stillness of a hunting ground between kills. Sarah got out of the car as if in a trance. She didn't look at our gear or at the tasks ahead of us. She walked directly to the fire pit, her steps slow and deliberate. She knelt, her fingers reaching out to trace the outline of a particularly large, flat stone at the edge of the pit. I knew from the reports that this was where they had found Mark's backpack, leaning against the rock as if he'd just set it down. Sarah. He was sitting right here, facing the fire. He must have been looking at the big fir tree. She looked up at the ancient tree, her gaze traveling up its massive trunk into the dark canopy, as if she was trying to see what he saw in his final moments. Was he relaxed? Was he listening to the creak? Or was he looking at something standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight? I had to break the spell, the inertia. If we just stood there, letting the atmosphere of the place seep into our bones, we'd be lost before nightfall. Alex, okay, let's get the tents up before we lose the light. My voice sounded unnaturally loud, an intrusion on the sacred quiet. I began to unload our equipment with a methodical, almost frantic efficiency. The rhythmic clatter and snap of setting up camp was a ritual I clung to, a mantra of normalcy against the encroaching strangeness. Unpack the tents, lay out the ground tarps, unroll the sleeping bags, set up the cooler and the camp stove. Each task was a brick I was laying, building a small wall of mundane reality around us. We erected our 2 tents on opposite sides of the fire pit, about 20 feet apart. It was an unspoken agreement. We were a team, but our grief and our beliefs about what happened here were our own private burdens. My tent faced the car, my subconscious seeking a connection to our escape route. Sarah's tent faced the trail that led deeper into the woods, the path Mark had supposedly taken for a short evening hike. She was facing the mystery head-on. As the sun began its final, rapid descent behind the jagged peaks to the west, the character of the forest underwent a terrifying transformation. The warm, golden light of the magic hour was replaced by long, deep blue shadows that bled out from the base of the trees. The woods became a wall of impenetrable blackness, and the clearing felt less like a campsite and more like a stage, illuminated by the fading sky. The temperature plummeted, and the sounds changed. The cheerful, random chatter of the forest, the scolding of a jay, the chittering of a squirrel, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, all of it just stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The only sound left was the ceaseless, hypnotic murmur of Whisper Creek. The silence it left behind was profound. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. We built a fire. I used some of the firewood that Mark himself had left behind, still neatly stacked and covered by a small tarp. Using it felt like a weird mix of tribute and desecration. The flames leaped up, bright and orange, pushing back the darkness to the edge of the clearing. It created a small, fragile bubble of warmth and light, but it only served to make the surrounding blackness seem deeper, more absolute. I made us some food can chili heated over the flames. We ate from tin bowls sitting on a log near the fire. The food tasted metallic, flavorless. I couldn't stop my eyes from darting towards the tree lean. It was impossible to shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a paranoid fantasy. It felt like a physical pressure on the back of my neck. Sarah wasn't eating. She was staring into the flames, her expression unreadable. After a few minutes of this, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was an old brass compass, military style, with a hinged lid. It had been Mark's, a gift from his grandfather. It was his most prized possession. Alex. Sarah, what are you doing with that? Sarah. The forums. They call it the Oz factor. A lot of the accounts, the credible ones, they say that right before something happens, things stop working. GPS units lose signal, phones die, even old, reliable things get weird. Compasses spin. Watches stop. She opened the lid and held the compass flat in the palm of her hand. The firelight glinted off the glass. The luminous needle trembled for a second, then settled, pointing steadily towards what I assumed was magnetic north. Sarah, it's still okay. For now. She carefully placed the compass on the flat rock near the fire, the same rock where Mark's backpack had been. She angled it so we could both see its face from where we sat. It was no longer just a compass. It was a sentinel, a warning device. We sat there for another hour, maybe more. The fire crackled. The creek murmured. The silence of the woods pressed in. And then the first truly unexplainable thing happened. It began as a vibration more than a sound. I felt it through the soles of my boots, a low-frequency thrumming that seemed to rise up from the ground itself. Then it entered my ears, a low, resonant hum. It wasn't the sound of machinery. It had an organic quality, like the deep purr of a colossal cat, but it was perfectly monotonic. It didn't fluctuate in pitch or volume, and it was impossible to locate. It seemed to come from the trees, from the air, from inside my own skull all at once. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, fixed on me. There was no fear in them yet, just a raw, intense vindication. Sarah. You hear it, don't you, Alex? You can't deny this one. I wanted to. My God, I wanted to. My mind was a flurry of desperate rationalizations. A deep underground water pump for the ranger station? An atmospheric phenomenon? A strange echo from a distant highway? But none of it fit. We were miles from anything. And the sound, it felt too close, too pervasive. It felt like the resonant frequency of the place itself. I gave a slow, reluctant nod. Her point was made. Alex, I hear it. The hum lasted for what was probably only 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. It was invasive. It wormed its way into my head, making my teeth ache and my vision swim slightly at the edges. It wasn't a hostile sound, but it was profoundly alien. It was the sound of something that did not belong in the natural world. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The cutoff was so sharp, so absolute, that the returning silence felt deafening. Sarah finally looked away from me, back towards the fire. Sarah. That's the sound he told me about. The hum in his head. It wasn't in his head, Alex. It was out here. It was calling to him. My blood ran cold. The story about Mark's distraction, his internal hum, suddenly snapped into terrifying focus. It wasn't a symptom of stress. It was a signal. My skepticism wasn't just cracked anymore. It was shattered. The hammer of that impossible sound had smashed it to pieces. I thought about the gear in my bag. I pulled out my professional audio recorder, a sensitive Tascam device. I switched it on, the small red record light a tiny beacon of defiance. I placed it on the rock next to the compass. If that sound came back, I would capture it. I would have proof, tangible scientific data to show to who would believe it. At that moment, I realized I wasn't recording it for anyone else. I was recording it for myself, to prove to myself in the morning that I hadn't gone insane. By 11 p.m., the exhaustion was becoming unbearable. It was a heavy, leaden thing, more than just lack of sleep. It felt like the place itself was draining us. Alex, We should try to get some sleep. We can take shifts if you want. Sarah. I'm not sleeping. The forums say the peak time is between 2 and 4 a.m. The witching hours. They say that's when the veil is thinnest. That's when things cross over. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, as if she were discussing a weather forecast. That's when Mark's watch stopped. It was found in his backpack. The hands were frozen at 3:17 a.m. I hadn't known that detail. The police report had simply listed the watch as non-functional. 3:17 a.m. Defeated, I retreated to my tent. Sleep was an absurd fantasy, but I needed to at least lie down. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, but I left the tent's rainfly open and the inner mesh flap unzipped just a few inches, creating a narrow slit through which I could see the dying embers of the fire, the rock with its silent sentinels, and the dark silhouette of Sarah's tent. I lay there, fully clothed, my mag light clutched in my hand, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The murmur of the creek no longer sounded like water over rocks. It sounded like whispers, 1,000 indistinct voices murmuring just below the edge of comprehension. I don't know if I slept. Maybe I drifted into a state of hypnagogic terror, a borderland between waking and dreaming. But I was snapped back to full, heart-stopping consciousness by a single, sharp sound that cut through the night. It was Sarah's voice, a sharp, stifled gasp. I sat bolt upright, my knuckles white on the flashlight. My eyes flew to the slit in my tent. The fire was just a bed of faint, pulsing red coals. The moonlight was brighter now, casting the clearing in a stark, black and silver relief. And I saw it. On the wall of Sarah's tent, a shadow was projected from the inside. It was her own shadow sitting up, but there was another shadow on the outside. It was impossibly tall and disturbingly thin, a stark, elongated silhouette against the pale nylon. It was motionless, a silent figure standing just outside her tent. And then I saw the zipper tab on her tent door. It was moving. It was being pulled downwards, slowly, inch by agonizing inch, deliberately, silently, from the outside. A wave of ice and adrenaline crashed through me. This was it. It was happening. Protective instinct overrode every rational thought. I fumbled for the zipper on my own tent, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the tab. The sound of my zipper ripping open was like a gunshot in the dead quiet night. I burst out of the tent, thumbing the switch on my mag light. A powerful beam of white light cut through the darkness, and I aimed it directly at Sarah's tent. There was nothing there. The space where the tall shadow had been was empty. The woods behind it were still and silent. The zipper on Sarah's tent was halfway down, the flap hanging open, swaying gently. Sarah was scrambled into the far corner of her tent, her face a mask of pure, abject terror. She was staring at the empty space where the thing had just been. Alex? Sarah, are you okay? What was that? I scrambled over to her tent, my flashlight beams slashing wildly across the campsite perimeter, searching the treeline, the path, the darkness. Nothing. No sound of retreating footsteps. No snapping twigs. Just the endless murmur of the creek. She was trembling uncontrollably, hugging her knees to her chest. Sarah. It was right there, Alex. I saw the shadow through the tent. I woke up, I just felt it, like a pressure, and I saw it, so tall. And its fingers, oh God, its fingers were so long. It was pulling the zipper down, so slowly. It was looking in at me. I knelt, my own heart hammering. I aimed the flashlight at the ground in front of her tent. The soil was soft and damp from the dew. My own boot prints were clearly visible from when I'd rushed over. But there were no other prints. None. Not a single indentation. It was impossible. Anything that tall, anything with physical mass would have left a trace. My mind, my poor, battered, rational mind, tried to reassert itself. A dream, a nightmare, hypnagogia, stress-induced hallucination. Alex, Sarah, listen. Listen to me. It had to be a dream. This place, it's getting to us. It was a nightmare. Sarah, it wasn't a dream, she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. It was real. It touched the tent. You scared it away, Alex. When you came out, it was gone. I looked from her terrified face to the impossibly undisturbed ground. My logical explanation was so close, so comforting. It had to be a dream. And then my eyes fell on the rock by the fire pit. And my world ended. Mark's compass wasn't just spinning. That would have been strange enough. The needle was a blur. It was rotating at an impossible speed, a frantic, silent pirouette, whining like a tiny gyroscope, as if the magnetic poles of the earth had ceased to exist and it was searching desperately for an anchor in a sea of chaos. And next to it, my Tascam audio recorder, my instrument of logic and proof, was dead. The little red light wasn't on. The screen was blank. The batteries, brand new energizers I had put in just hours before, had been completely and utterly drained in an instant. I stared at the spinning compass and the dead recorder, the cold moonlight glinting off their surfaces. My attempted explanations, my desperate clinging to the rational, all of it felt so foolish, so naive, so childish. A dream can't do that. A hallucination can't drain a battery. Stress can't break the laws of physics. Everything Sarah had said, every late-night phone call, every forum post, every wild theory, it all coalesced in that single, horrifying moment into an undeniable, terrifying truth. She was right. He was taken. And the thing that took him was still here. We weren't alone in the woods. We were in its home. And we had just announced our presence. Sleep was not an option. To even close our eyes would have been an act of surrender, a concession to the madness that now lapped at the edges of our small, fragile reality. After the event at Sarah's tent, after seeing the impossible dance of the compass and the silent death of my recorder, we abandoned any pretense of rest. We retreated from our tents, which now felt like flimsy nylon coffins, and spent the remainder of the night sitting on a log, our backs pressed together. It was a primal animal posture, a two-headed creature trying to watch all directions at once. I had retrieved the shotgun from the car. I'm not a hunter. I'm not even particularly comfortable with firearms. But its cold, heavy weight in my hands was a small, desperate anchor to a world where physical threats could be met with physical force. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it would be utterly useless against whatever was out there. But my hands needed something to do other than tremble. We didn't speak. What was there to say? I believe you now? It felt so inadequate, so insulting to the magnitude of what we were experiencing. My entire worldview, the carefully constructed edifice of logic and reason I had inhabited for my entire life, had been demolished in an instant. I was adrift in my sister's terrifying reality, and I was beginning to understand that she hadn't been drowning in it. She had simply been learning how to breathe its toxic air. The forest was not silent for the rest of the night. It was filled with a low, constant hum of activity that I had been deaf to before. Twigs snapped just beyond the range of our flashlights. The undergrowth rustled with the movement of things that seemed too heavy to be small animals. And the whispers were constant. The sound of the creek had become a carrier wave for 1,000 hushed, sibilant voices that I could never quite make out. It was the sound of a crowd in the next room, a party to which we were not invited. The compass on the rock eventually slowed, its needle quivering and shuddering like an exhausted animal before finally, reluctantly, pointing north again as the first hint of gray began to poison the eastern sky. The show was over. The curtain had fallen. Morning did not arrive with the gentle grace of a new day. It crept in under the cover of a thick, wet, suffocating fog. It rolled in from the creek, a silent, white tide that swallowed the trees, the trail, and the edges of our clearing. It reduced our world to a 50-foot circle of visibility. It felt tactical. It felt like the environment itself was conspiring to keep us disoriented, to keep us trapped. The air was cold and damp, and the world was muted, wrapped in a blanket of gray. The terror of the night receded with the darkness, but it didn't disappear. It simply changed its form. It solidified from a sharp, heart-pounding panic into a cold, heavy dread that sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone. My only thought was escape. Pack the car. Drive. Do not stop until we see streetlights and concrete. But Sarah was different. The night had changed her, too. As she emerged from her sleeping bag, her movements were no longer frail or hesitant. The victim was gone. In her place was an investigator. The confirmation of her deepest fears had not broken her. It had galvanized her. The terror had burned away her grief, leaving behind a core of pure, terrifying resolve. She looked at me, her eyes clear and steady for the first time in a year. "Sarah, I'm making coffee. Then we're going to walk his trail." The words hit me like a physical blow. The thought of leaving the relative safety of this clearing, of willingly walking into the fog-shrouded woods that had birthed last night's horror, was inconceivable. "Alex." "What?" "No, absolutely not." "Sarah, are you insane? We're leaving. We pack the car and we leave right now." "Sarah." "The car won't start, Alex. You know it won't. The battery will be dead. Played with our phones, your recorder. It won't let us leave yet. It's not done with us." I didn't want to believe her, but I knew she was right. It was a checkmate I hadn't even seen coming. We were stranded, hostages of the landscape itself. "Sarah, last night was a greeting. It was letting us know it sees us. But it didn't happen here in the clearing. It happened to Mark when he was out there." She gestured with her head towards the trailhead, a dark, tunnel-like opening in the fog. "He went for a walk. He never came back. We need to find where his walk ended. We're not looking for him anymore, Alex. We're looking for the place. The thin spot the people in the forums talk about. A place where the energy is focused. The place where we might get an answer." Her logic was insane, built upon a foundation of internet ghost stories, but it was also undeniable, built upon the evidence of the spinning compass and the tall, silent shadow. She was operating on the new rules of this place, while I was still reeling from the fact that the old rules no longer applied. I looked from her determined face to the shotgun in my lap, and I understood that I had no choice. She would go with or without me, and I couldn't let her go alone. My role had changed. I was no longer her anchor to reality. I was her backup in a world that was no longer real. We prepared in near silence. We packed a single-day bag. Water, a comprehensive first aid kit that now felt laughably inadequate, protein bars, and every piece of recording equipment we had left. I put fresh batteries in my spare audio recorder and my smaller point-and-shoot camera. I knew they would likely fail, but I had to try. I had to document this. My writer's brain, even in its terror, needed to impose a narrative, to gather evidence, to create a record. If we disappeared out here, I wanted something left behind to tell the story. Sarah held Mark's compass. It had become her talisman, her divining rod. We stood at the edge of the campsite, at the mouth of the trail. The fog swirled around our ankles. Stepping onto that path felt like stepping off a cliff. The trail was a narrow, winding path that was supposed to follow the creek in a 2-mile loop. In the fog, it was a disorienting, claustrophobic tunnel through a gray, featureless world. The colossal trees disappeared into the white void above us. We could see no more than 20 or 30 feet ahead. Every step felt like a gamble, a step into a complete unknown. We walked for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes. A strange sense of vertigo began to set in. The scenery seemed to be repeating itself, the same gnarled roots snaking across the path, the same clusters of unnaturally green ferns, the same moss-covered rocks. Felt like we were on a treadmill, walking but going nowhere. I was constantly checking over my shoulder, but the path behind us was swallowed by the fog as quickly as we covered it. It was Sarah who stopped first. She stood perfectly still, her head cocked, a frown on her face. "Alex, what is it? You see something?" "Sarah, no, listen." I stopped, holding my breath, straining my ears, and then I realized what she had noticed. The ever-present sound of Whisper Creek, the sound that had been the constant backdrop to our entire experience, was gone. It was not quieter. It was gone. Completely. The silence that replaced it was absolute, profound, and deeply unnatural. It was a vacuum. I could hear the blood pulsing in my own ears. I took a breath, and the sound of it seemed dead, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. My ears began to pop, a painful pressure building as if we had suddenly changed altitude. A wave of intense nausea rolled through me. "Alex, what's happening? Where did the creek go?" "Sarah, we're in it. A thin spot, an area of effect." She was pointing. Her hand was trembling, but her finger was steady. She was pointing to a spot about 50 yards off the main trail. Through a momentary, swirling break in the fog, I saw it. It was a clearing, but it was nothing like our campsite. It was a perfect, geometric circle in the forest floor, about 30 feet in diameter. The ground inside the circle was completely bare, a patch of flat, brown, compacted earth where nothing grew. No grass, no weeds, no moss. It was a dead spot, but it was the trees surrounding it that stole the breath from my lungs. They were ancient, towering pines, but they were all wrong. They weren't growing straight. Every single tree on the perimeter of that circle was bent backwards, away from the center, as if recoiling from a source of immense, constant power. Their trunks were twisted, their branches gnarled and contorted, all pointing outwards, like the arms of people trying to flee an explosion in slow motion. It was a tableau of silent, arboreal terror that had been playing out for decades or centuries. A morbid, irresistible curiosity pulled us forward. We left the false safety of the trail and pushed through the damp undergrowth. The moment our feet left the path and stepped into the small wooded area surrounding the circle, the sound of the world rushed back in with a painful jolt. The murmur of the creek, the whisper of the wind in the high branches, the distant call of a bird was all there again. It was so sudden, so jarring, that I stumbled and caught myself on a tree. We had passed through an invisible wall of silence. We stood at the edge of the bare circle. The air within it shimmered slightly, like the heat haze above asphalt. I could feel a low-level static electricity in the air. It raised the hairs on my arms and made the fillings in my teeth ache with a low, dull throb. This was the place. There was no doubt. This was the altar. Sarah's face was ashen, but her eyes, those terribly determined eyes, were burning. "Sarah, this is it, Alex. I can feel him here. This is where it happened." Before I could stop her, she took a step, crossing the threshold from the living forest into the dead circle. "Alex, Sarah, no. Wait, don't go in there." She didn't hear me, or she didn't care. She walked to the absolute center of the bare earth and stood there, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke to the empty, silent air. Sarah. Mark? Sarah. I'm here. If you can hear me, if any part of you is still here, please. Give me a sign. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I stood frozen at the edge, a helpless observer at a mad seance. My hand went to the small camera hanging around my neck, but I couldn't bring myself to raise it. To document this felt like a violation. It felt like I was inviting the abyss to look back through the lens. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. There was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the throb of static from the circle. I began to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe this was it, the final delusion. We had found a strange, but natural geological anomaly, and Sarah's grief was doing the rest. And then I heard it. It was not a sound in the air. It was a voice inside my own head, faint, distorted, like a transmission from a vast distance, skipping across an ocean of static. And it was unquestionably, unmistakably Mark's voice. Mark's voice. Sarah? So sorry, I'm stuck. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She had heard it too. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Sarah. Mark, I'm here. I can hear you. Where are you? What happened? The internal voice came again, a little stronger this time, laced with a new and terrifying quality. Confusion. Mark's voice. So cold here, there's no time. I see the light it's the wrong color, it's wrong. My paralysis broke. My scientific instinct, my need for proof took over. I ripped the spare audio recorder from my bag, thumbed the record button, and held it out, pointing it at Sarah, at the empty center of the circle. Alex? Mark, it's Alex. We're here. Can you tell us where you are? Tell us what took you. There was a burst of pure static in my head, a sound like tearing metal. And then the voice came one last time. It was no longer faint or confused. It was loud, clear, and filled with a surge of pure, undiluted panic. It was a scream from another dimension. Mark's voice. It's not what you think. It's a trap. It doesn't take you up. It takes you in. It unfolds you. God. It unfolds you. Alex, you have to get her out of there. Now. It knows you're here. It heard you. The voice was cut off, sliced in mid-sentence, replaced by an inhuman shriek that was both telepathic and audible. It was a piercing, metallic, biological sound that bypassed my ears and drilled directly into my brainstem. Simultaneously, every piece of functioning technology we had died. The small screen on my camera flashed a rainbow of pixelated garbage before going black. The red recording light on the audio recorder in my hand blinked once, twice, and then extinguished. The compass Sarah was holding clattered to the ground as the needle began to spin with the same impossible violence as the night before. The fog, which had been lingering at the edges of the woods, began to move. It didn't drift. It poured into the clearing, rushing towards the circle from all sides with unnatural speed, like a reversed waterfall. It was thick and oily and swirled around Sarah, who was standing frozen in the center, her face a mask of horror. In seconds, she was completely obscured by the churning white vortex. Alex? Sarah. Primal terror, the kind that lives in the oldest part of the brain, took over. I didn't think. I ran. I plunged into the freezing, blinding fog, into the heart of the circle, my arms flailing in front of me. Sarah! I screamed her name, but the fog seemed to snatch the sound from my mouth. For 3 terrifying seconds, I couldn't find her. I was blind, disoriented, the static in the air now a roaring physical force. This is it, I thought. This is how it happens. You just step inside and cease to be. Then my hand brushed against her jacket. I grabbed a fistful of the material and pulled. She was rigid, cold as ice, and unresponsive. I wrapped my arm around her waist and hauled her backwards with all the strength I possessed, dragging her stumbling, lifeless form out of the swirling vortex, out of the dead circle. The instant our feet touched the living earth of the forest floor, it was as if we had crossed a finish line. The shriek stopped, the static vanished, and the fog snapped back to the perimeter of the circle as if yanked by 1,000 invisible strings, leaving the center clear and empty once more. Sarah collapsed onto the mossy ground, gasping, shuddering, drawing in air as if she had been holding her breath for an hour. I knelt beside her, my own lungs burning, my body trembling with a violent, post-adrenaline crash. We looked back at the circle. It was just a patch of bare earth again, silent, waiting, an empty stage. As I helped her to her feet, my eyes caught a glint of metal on the ground, just at the edge of the circle, half hidden by a clump of ferns. It was not the compass. It was something else. I bent down and picked it up. It was a Zippo lighter. The chrome was tarnished, pitted from exposure to the elements. I turned it over in my shaking hand. On the side, worn but still legible, were the engraved initials MK. Mark's lighter. He had carried it for 15 years. It hadn't been here a year ago. The search teams had swept this entire area with metal detectors. They had combed every square inch. They would not have missed this. It had been left for us. A receipt for our transaction. A small, cold, metal souvenir from the echo in the woods. A piece of proof that would ensure we never mistook what happened here for a dream. The walk back from the circle of trees was not a walk. It was a retreat. A full-scale, disorganized flight from a battle we had already lost. Every shred of my composure was gone, burned away by the psychic shriek and the impossible sight of Mark's lighter appearing out of thin air. I clutched it in my pocket, its cold, hard reality a terrifying counterpoint to the madness we had just witnessed. It was my proof, and it was my damnation. I didn't need to look at Sarah to know she was in a similar state. The manic resolve she'd had that morning was gone, replaced by the stark, hollow-eyed terror of someone who has stared into the abyss and seen it stare back with cold, intellectual curiosity. She had called out for a sign, and the universe had answered with a dial tone from hell. The forest itself felt different now. It was no longer a neutral, if unsettling, setting. It felt actively, malevolently aware of us. The fog was its breath. The tangled roots were its snares. Every gust of wind through the high branches sounded like a cold, dismissive chuckle. The feeling of being watched was no longer a subtle pressure on the back of my neck. It was a certainty, a palpable presence in the air around us. We were two mice in a cage, and the scientist had just concluded its experiment. Now we were just waiting to be disposed of. When we finally stumbled back into the clearing of Campsite 7, the sight of our tents and my SUV did not bring relief. It brought a new, more immediate kind of fear. The clearing no longer felt like the epicenter. It felt like the kill floor. It was the place we had been lured back to, the place where the final act was set to unfold. As if on cue, the sky began to change. The flat, gray ceiling of fog started to darken, swirling with shades of bruised purple and sickly green. The wind, which had been just a whisper, began to pick up, gusting through the clearing with a low, mournful howl. A storm was rolling in, fast and violent, and my mind, no longer capable of seeing coincidence, knew with absolute certainty that this was not a random weather event. The atmosphere was responding to us, to our trespass. The stage was being set. Alex, pack, now, everything in the car. Just throw it in. We're leaving. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded my system. The only coherent thought I could form was escape. I started tearing down my tent with frantic, clumsy hands, not bothering to fold it, just stuffing the nylon and poles into their bag. I dragged our coolers, our bags, our stove, all our pathetic little artifacts of civilization, and began heaving them into the back of the SUV. The sounds of my frantic packing were harsh and loud against the rising wind. I turned to see Sarah just standing by the cold fire pit, her back to me. She was clutching Mark's lighter, her knuckles white. She was staring off into the woods, towards the trailhead, as if waiting for someone to emerge. Sarah. We can't just leave him here, Alex. I froze, a half-packed sleeping bag in my hands. I walked over to her, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall, sizzling on the dark stones of the fire pit. Alex, Sarah, he's not here. You heard him. He's trapped. He's in the static. Somewhere we can't get to. Staying here won't help him. Staying here is suicide. Sarah. But it spoke to us. Through him. It knows we're here. It knows we can hear it. Maybe if we stay, it will talk again. He could tell us more. He could tell us how to. I couldn't let her finish. I grabbed her by the shoulders, my grip probably too tight, and forced her to look at me. Her eyes were wild, her pupils blown wide. She was in deep shock, her mind manufacturing a desperate, insane strand of hope to cling to. Alex, listen to me. Listen. That thing in there is not a switchboard operator connecting a call from the great beyond. It's a predator. A cat playing with a mouse before it eats it. It let us hear him to see what we would do. It was an experiment. You heard the panic in his voice, Sarah. The last thing he said was for us to get you out. For us to run. We have to honor that. We have to get out of here. Please. Thunder cracked directly overhead. A violent, splintering sound that shook the very ground. The rain, which had been just a few drops, became a sudden torrential downpour. It was as if my plea had broken some final seal. The shock of the thunder and the cold, driving rain seemed to finally break through her trance. She gave a single, convulsive shudder and then nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. I didn't wait for her to change her mind. I hustled her to the passenger side of the car, opened the door, and all but pushed her inside. I threw the last of our gear into the back, not even bothering with the tent, leaving it half collapsed in the mud. I slammed the trunk door shut. The sound was a definitive metallic boom. We are leaving. I scrambled into the driver's seat, soaked to the bone in seconds, the rain hammering on the roof of the car like a drum roll. I slammed the door, plunging us into a world of smeared glass and roaring sound. I didn't waste a second. I jammed the key into the ignition, my heart pounding with a desperate, frantic hope. I turned the key. Click. A single, metallic, impotent sound. All the lights on the dashboard, which should have flared to life, remained dead and dark. Alex. No. No, 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 no. I tried again. Click. And again. Click. And again. Click. 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 The battery was completely, totally, and utterly dead. The life had been surgically excised from the car, just as it had been from my recorder and camera. Sarah had been right. It was never going to let us leave. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel, a wave of utter, soul-crushing despair washing over me. We were trapped. From the passenger seat, a sound began. It was Sarah laughing. It wasn't a laugh of mirth or hysteria. It was a dry, broken, rattling sound from the back of her throat. The sound of a mind that has finally accepted the absolute absurdity of its situation. Sarah. Of course it is. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. It doesn't want us to leave until the performance is over. The sun, which had been hidden behind the clouds, was now completely gone. A premature, Suffocating darkness fell over the campsite. The world outside the windshield a maelstrom of wind, rain, and shadow. Our SUV, our supposed metal shell of safety, now felt like a cage. A terrarium. A viewing box for the main event. And then, through the rain-streaked windshield, we saw the light. It started deep within the woods, in the direction of the trail to the circle. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing flash of lightning. It was a soft, gentle, pulsing glow. A sickly, pale green light, the color of phosphorescence on a rotting log, or the glow of deep-sea creatures. It cast no distinct beams. It simply emanated, staining the fog and the rain a nauseating shade of green. We both stared, frozen, mesmerized. The light began to drift, moving slowly, silently through the trees, its movement too smooth, too deliberate to be natural. It rose above the treeline, a great, silent, amorphous sphere of pulsing green energy, perhaps 50 or 60 feet across. The rain seemed to curve around it, creating a bizarre, shimmering dome effect. Directly beneath it, the ground remained eerily dry. The humming sound started again. But this was not the low thrum of the first night. This was a higher-pitched, more complex symphony of wrongness. There were layers to it. A high-frequency whine, a low, guttural vibration, and woven through it all, a sound that made my skin crawl, a rapid series of sharp, wet, clicking noises. It sounded like 1,000 chattering insects, or the frantic clacking of a Geiger counter signaling lethal radiation. It was the sound of something utterly alien trying to communicate, or perhaps just processing. And then I saw them. They emerged from the treeline, stepping into the eerie green glow at the edge of the clearing. One, then two, then three. My mind simply stopped working. Everything I had dismissed, everything Sarah had tried to tell me from her dream, was standing right there. They were real. They were impossibly tall, perhaps 8 or 9 feet, and disturbingly thin, like figures stretched on a rack. Their limbs were too long, their arms hanging down to their knees, ending in hands with long, delicate, multi-jointed fingers. Their legs bent at an angle that no human leg should bend. They were naked, their skin a pale, luminous, grayish-white, like the belly of a dead fish. They had no discernible faces, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, ovoid heads that tilted in a slow, curious, bird-like manner as they observed us. They didn't move towards us. They simply stood there, at the edge of the woods, silent and still. Their stillness was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in my life. It was not the stillness of patience, but the absolute stillness of a thing that has no concept of threat, a thing of such supreme power and confidence that it has no need to move. It was the stillness of a biologist observing a new species of insect before deciding whether to pin it to a board. My body was paralyzed. My lungs had forgotten how to draw breath. My throat had forgotten how to make a sound. I was locked in a state of pure, existential terror, a fear so profound it bordered on a religious experience. In that moment, I understood what it must feel like to be an ant realizing that the sky above it is actually the bottom of a boot. I was small, insignificant, and utterly, totally helpless. But Sarah did something I will never comprehend. With a steady hand, she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Alex," Sarah, "no, stay in the car. Lock the door." She didn't listen. She pushed the car door open, a gust of wind and rain blasting into the cabin. She stepped out into the storm, into the green, unholy light. She stood there, a tiny, defiant figure, her red hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked. She held up Mark's lighter, holding it out in front of her like a crucifix against a vampire. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was a raw, grief-stricken, furious scream that cut through the howl of the wind. "Sarah, What do you want from us? You took him. You took my husband. Give him back. Give him back to me. The three figures all tilted their heads at the exact same moment, a synchronized, unnatural motion. The clicking sound intensified, growing frantic, agitated. The green light above them pulsed violently, and the air crackled with a visible static charge. And then one of the figures, the one in the center, slowly raised one of its long, slender arms. It extended a single, needle-thin finger, and it pointed. It wasn't pointing at Sarah. It was pointing directly at me in the driver's seat. The world dissolved. The humming and clicking became a deafening roar that was not in my ears but inside my skull, vibrating every molecule of my being. The green light flared, engulfing my vision in a blinding, painful flash. I felt a tremendous, crushing pressure on my chest, a sensation of being pulled in 1,000 directions at once while simultaneously being squeezed into a single point. It was the feeling Mark's voice had described. It was the feeling of being unfolded. My consciousness fractured. I saw images that my brain could not process. Starfields swirling in impossible colors. Complex geometric patterns that folded and unfolded in on themselves. I saw the forest from 100 different angles at once. I saw the inside of my own circulatory system, a river of red against the green light. Time became meaningless, stretching into an eternity and snapping back into a microsecond. And through the roaring chaos, I heard Mark's voice one last time. It was not a plea. It was not a whisper from the static. It was a clear, sharp, powerful command, injected directly into the core of my being. Mark's voice, run. The single, primal word was a defibrillator to my paralyzed soul. It shattered the psychic assault. Survival instinct, raw and pure, surged past the terror. I don't remember making a decision. One moment I was being torn apart by light and sound. The next my hand was on the door handle. I threw the door open and tumbled out, falling to my hands and knees in the cold, wet mud. The world snapped back into focus. I scrambled to my feet. I grabbed Sarah's arm, my grip like a vice. He said to run. We have to run. Now. We didn't look back. We turned our backs on the light, on the silent, watching figures, and we ran. We plunged into the pitch-black woods on the opposite side of the clearing, away from the trail, away from everything. We crashed through thick undergrowth, thorns and branches tearing at our clothes and skin. We slipped and fell in the mud, scrambled back up, and kept running, fueled by a terror that was beyond human comprehension. Behind us, the green glow and the horrifying symphony of sounds began to fade, not because we were outrunning them, but as if the entity had simply switched off its attention. The show was over. The specimens had fled the petri dish. We ran blindly, with no sense of direction, just away. We ran until our lungs felt like they were on fire, until our legs were jelly, until we couldn't take another step. We finally collapsed in a heap, miles from the campsite, deep in the storm-drenched forest, hidden by the blessed, mundane darkness. We lay there in the mud and the rain, gasping, sobbing, utterly and completely broken. The longest night was over. But we knew, with a certainty that would be branded on our souls forever, that the darkness would never truly leave us again. There is no vocabulary for the state we were in. Language is a product of the known world, a tool designed to describe shared human experience. We had just returned from a place where language did not apply. Exhausted is a word for after a long hike. Terrified is a word for a near miss on the highway. What we were was something else entirely. We were hollowed out, scoured clean by a fear so absolute, so alien, that it had fundamentally rewritten our source code. We lay there in the mud for what could have been minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. The adrenaline had abandoned us, leaving behind a deep, cellular exhaustion and a pain that was more than physical. It was the pain of a mind that has been stretched beyond its capacity and is struggling to snap back into a recognizable shape. The storm passed, and the blackness of the night began to soften into the bruised gray of dawn. The world slowly returned to us, but it was not the same world we had left. We helped each other to our feet, our movements stiff and clumsy like elderly automata. Every muscle screamed in protest. We didn't dare try to find our way back to the campsite. The thought of seeing that clearing again, of seeing our abandoned car and tent under the unforgiving light of day, was more than either of us could stomach. The campsite was a contaminated zone, a place of psychic radiation we could never safely approach again. There was only one way to go: forward. We found the gravel road, now a muddy track of ruts and puddles, and we began to walk. We didn't know how many miles it was to the ranger station. We didn't care. We just put one foot in front of the other, a slow, shambling, two-person funeral procession moving away from the grave of our former selves. The post-storm air was clean and cold, thick with the scent of ozone and wet pine. Every leaf on every tree glistened with a diamond lattice of water droplets. Sarah was silent. She walked with her head down, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on her own muddy boots. The furious, defiant woman who had screamed at the green light was gone. The obsessive investigator was gone. The grieving widow was gone. I didn't know who this new person was, and I was too afraid to ask. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was packed tight with the shared, unutterable memory of tall, gray figures and the telepathic voice of a dead man. To speak of it would be to risk shattering the fragile truce we had made with our own sanity. After 2 hours of this slow, painful march, just as a cold despair was beginning to set in, we heard it. A low rumble growing steadily louder. It was the sound of an engine, the sound of the other world, the normal world. A massive, mud-splattered logging truck came around a bend, its headlights still on in the morning gloom. It slowed as it approached us. The hiss of its air breaks a celestial song. The driver, a large man in his 60s with a thick gray beard and kind, weary eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, leaned across the cab and rolled down the passenger window. He took one long look at our pathetic state, the mud, the scratches, the hollow-eyed shock, and his weathered face creased with concern. Truck driver, my God in heaven, what in the hell happened to you two? Get hit by a bear. I opened my mouth, 100 impossible explanations dying on my tongue. We were visited by interdimensional beings who communicated via a telepathic echo of my dead brother-in-law. The absurdity of the truth was a physical barrier in my throat. It was Sarah who answered. Her voice was a perfect monotone, devoid of any inflection, any emotion. It was the flattest sound I have ever heard. Sarah, our car broke down, up at campsite 7. The storm, we panicked. We tried to walk out. The lie was so simple, so plausible. A perfect piece of camouflage to hide the monstrous truth. The trucker accepted it without a flicker of doubt. He was a man of the physical world, of diesel engines and felled trees. Bears and storms were dangers he understood. He helped us into the warm, rumbling cab of his truck, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and sawdust. He gave us a thermos of coffee so hot and sweet it was almost painful to drink, but the warmth spreading through my chest felt like the first stirrings of life. He told us his name was Gus, and he didn't ask any more questions, for which I will be eternally grateful. He just drove, letting the roar of his engine fill the space our own words could not. He drove us to the ranger station. Ranger Jenkins was on the porch, nursing a mug of what I assumed was coffee, watching the morning mist burn off the nearby peaks. When she saw us climb out of Gus's truck, Her expression was one I will never forget. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't alarm. It was a deep, profound, and soul-weary resignation. It was the look of a person seeing a sad, familiar story reach its inevitable conclusion. It was the exact same look of pity I had seen in her eyes the day before. She knew. We told her the same lie Sarah had told Gus. Car broke down. Panicked in the storm. Left everything behind. She listened patiently, nodding, her gaze moving between my scratched face and Sarah's vacant eyes. She wrote it all down on a clipboard, her pen scratching on the paper. Ranger Jenkins, Campsite 7, right? I'll get a call into town, have Mel's towing go up and get the vehicle. You'll have to give them a statement, of course. For the abandoned gear. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked up, and her professional mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. She looked directly at me. Ranger Jenkins. You know my grandfather was a ranger in this same park. Back in the 40s and 50s. He used to say there are some places out here that are older than the trees. Places that have their own rules. He told me to never, ever stay the night up by the falls past the bend. Said the air gets thin up there. It was the closest she could come to an admission, an acknowledgement passed down through generations of those who watch over this forest, that there are things happening here that don't make it into the official reports. She was validating our terror without having to hear a word of it. Ranger Jenkins, there's a motel in town, the Pine Cone Inn. Get yourselves a room. Get cleaned up. The sheriff might want a word with you later. Just procedure. We thanked her and Gus and walked the quarter-mile into the tiny town, which was little more than a gas station, a diner, and the aforementioned Pine Cone Inn. The room was aggressively mundane, with a brown floral bedspread and a picture of a waterfall on the wall. It smelled of bleach and stale air. I have never been so grateful for four walls and a locking door in my life. I stood under the scalding spray of the shower for almost an hour, watching the mud and grime swirl down the drain. But no amount of hot water could wash away the feeling of the green light on my skin, or the memory of the psychic pressure in my skull. I was clean, but I would never be clean again. Sarah and I didn't speak. We moved around the small room like ghosts, occasionally making eye contact in the mirror. In her eyes, I saw my own horror reflected back at me. It was a perfect, terrible symmetry. We were the only two members of a club no one would ever want to join. The phone call came later that afternoon. It was Mel from the towing company. Mel, howdy folks. Mel here. Just wanted to let you know I got your SUV. She's down here at my garage. Funniest thing though. Alex? What's that? Mel. Well, you said the battery was dead as a doornail, right? I got up there, and just for the hell of it, before I hooked her up, I tried the key. Fired right up on the first turn. Purring like a kitten. Must be one of them intermittent electrical gremlins. Anyway, she's all set when you're ready. I hung up the phone, a cold smile touching my lips. Of course it started. Of course it did. The board had been reset for the next players. The game was over. The entity had wiped its fingerprints from the scene, leaving us with nothing but a story that no one would ever believe. It was the final, perfect act of psychological warfare. It was its way of telling us, it was real, and you can't prove a thing. The drive home was 500 miles of the heaviest silence I have ever known. It was no longer the silence of grief or the silence of dread. It was the silence of shared, incommunicable knowledge. We were two astronauts returned from a planet we could not describe, carrying an alien contagion in our minds. In the weeks and months that followed, I watched Sarah change. The obsessive, frantic energy was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet stillness. She packed up the last of Mark's things, not with tears, but with a kind of grim reverence. She stopped visiting the forums. She didn't need to anymore. She wasn't looking for answers. She had them. She had found a terrible kind of peace. The peace of knowing that her husband hadn't just died. He had been chosen. He had stepped through a doorway. And while she would mourn him forever, she no longer had to wonder. The uncertainty, which had been its own form of torture, was over. And me? I am the one left with the uncertainty. The skeptic died in that forest, and in his place is a man haunted by questions that have no answers. I became the obsessive one. I took the audio file from my dead record era file of pure, screeching staticto and audio engineer friend. He managed to filter out the noise, and what he found underneath wasn't a voice. It was a signal, a faint, repeating pattern of clicks and tones, a complex sequence that he said looked less like a language and more like a mathematical equation. A data packet. It was a tag. The entity had tagged us. I sit here now in my quiet office, surrounded by books that try to explain the world in rational terms. They all feel like children's stories now. On my desk, next to my keyboard, sits a tarnished Zippo lighter with the initials MK engraved on its side. Sometimes late at night I pick it up. Feels warm to the touch. I don't know what we saw in Whisper Creek National Forest. Aliens? Interdimensional beings? A life form that is to us what we are to bacteria? I don't have a name for it. All I have is the memory, the static, and the cold, hard certainty that we are not alone in this world, and that our reality is a fragile, permeable thing. We went back to the campsite where Mark vanished. We didn't find him, but we found what took him. We found a protocol that the wilderness follows, and it is older, stranger, and infinitely more terrifying than any human law. And it is still out there, in the deep, silent places, listening and waiting. Thank you for listening to this account, to my family's story. There are countless other protocols being followed in the wild places of this world, countless other stories that sound just as impossible. Maybe you have one of your own. If you wish to explore more narratives from the edge of our understanding, please consider subscribing to the Wilderness Protocol. Stay safe, and be careful what you listen for in the silence. You might just get an answer.